morning, everybody. I think we better get started, if that's okay. Okay, so if you can just find a seat, please. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Jan Bebbington. As you can see, Jan is the director of the Peatland Centre for Sustainability and Business at Lancaster University. And Jan is an accountant by trade. I don't know, she may tell you something about that later on. And for those of you who know about Jan's work, Jan works in the intersection between sustainability development and organisational operations, and your research is focusing on the really important sustainable development goals. If you don't know anything about it, I challenge you to have a look at the sustainable development goals and think about how your research can maybe link into those goals and to the achievement of them. And you also do a lot of work, Jan, in carbon accounting and accountability. You're involved at the moment in a really interesting project which is all about seafood business for ocean stewardship, so you'll be talking about that hopefully. Now, as you know, those of you who know Jan, you know she's very widely published in all of the major accounting journals, but I thought it was interesting, Jan, that you're starting to publish in other journals beyond accounting, for example, One Earth, etc. I thought that's quite interesting to actually go beyond accounting and to bring an accounting perspective to those other fields. So Jan, you've also held numerous editorial roles, and of course you've supervised and are supervising numerous PhD studies. So Jan has a wealth of experience and is a fantastic speaker, so I'm really interested. So Jan, thank you for contributing to this session. So
thank you, Joan, and yeah, okay, now she set the bar so high, all I can do is go crash it. So I want you to relax, because I'm going to work through a whole series of ideas. The detail of any one you don't need to have fully on top of, but I want to show you a broad sweep of activity, and in particular, I want you to leave this room knowing that you're much more interesting than anyone gives you credit for, and that there are a lot of people in other disciplines who don't even know that we exist, but want to work with us. And I suppose that comes back to the publishing in other places. So the links in the chain that I want to have a look at, so I'm going to have a look at a particular project that's been on the go for about 5 or 6 years, and the starting point of it was the Sustainable Development Goals. That's where I met and interacted with people from other disciplines. So while the SDGs are really relevant for our field, they are also the starting point for a conversation with other people as well. And I'm going to take you through a case study, CBOS, which is Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. This is, as you'll come to see, this is a consortium of companies who are trying to achieve particular outcomes, and they're working with a science team, of which I'm one of the social scientists on that team, to try to get to where they're going to. And so we're seeing a lot of work working with them. So I'm going to highlight how CBOS works, where the accounting and the finance fits into it, and then I'm going to look at supply chain risk mapping and a wee aside on finance. I'm not going to talk about other things that are going on within that project, which is looking at forced labour, both discovery and reporting, which is hugely difficult. I'm going to leave aside greenhouse gases, and I'm going to leave aside business and biodiversity intersections. And in particular, I was quite inspired by the mentors at this conference. So I looked at everyone who is sort of my age and stage working on it, and I looked at the fields that you're working in, and each one of those fields touched down somewhere in this interdisciplinary collaboration. And so I want you to be sure that you know that within your field, this is also relevant to you. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not hugely surprising. They've been around for a bit of time. They are the common ground on which businesses can think about their impact on broader agendas. These are intergovernmental goals that have been agreed through the United Nations process. We're just hitting the halfway mark. So 2030 is going to be the time where these goals come to a close, and there will be a subsequent agenda for sure. So these come from all of those international development priorities that governments have. The Millennium Development Goals preceded them. This is the phase we're in at the moment. And a lot of them have really strong connections to other international processes. So number 13 along the bottom, the IPCC Global Climate Change Agenda links closely to that. 14 and 15 together is the biodiversity international processes that are playing along as well. So CBOS then. CBOS, as I said, is a group of 10 companies that have come together in order to achieve particular outcomes. This is the company set, and this is where it starts looking quite different from the kind of things that we do in business and management. These 10 companies together are the largest, some of the largest, not quite the largest group of willing participants in the seafood industry. So a lot of the things that you might eat in terms of fish, some go through these organisations at some stage. 3 of them you probably never have heard of. Maruha is the largest by far. It's twice as big as the next one. It's the largest seafood company in the world, with Nizui and then Kikuyo as well. The other 3 Japanese companies, because Japan has got a huge seafood industry and it really matters in their operations. Then you've got Thai Union and CPF, which are 2 Thai companies who are really big in shrimps and prawns. So this is a run through a seafood platter after a sort. They're really quite interesting. They've got quite large family percentage ownerships, but they also are publicly listed as well. Thai Union has recently made a bit of news headlines by having a sustainability-linked loan. So their core financing activity is linked to their carbon and their human rights performance. And so these conditions are starting to infuse into the finance system. Skretting is owned by a privately held company, Nutreco. Cargill is also a privately held company. It's about 130 family owners from all cousins. You can imagine how hellish it would be in that boardroom working together. Cermaq is wholly owned by Mitsubishi, which you think of as a car company, but they built boats first. And so the main company that sits behind all of these, because they've got cross-holdings and everything. Dongwon, South Korean, big in tuna. Maui, farm fish, Norwegian. So what we have is a really different kind of cohort. They are assembled together by their ecological significance, not by economic characteristics, although their economic characteristics are also really interested, like who owns them, where do they report, what governance regimes do they sit under, etc., and what stock exchanges are listed on. So the hypothesis that we're working on, and this has been developed in conversation with our ecologist colleagues, is that if these 10 companies change, the whole industry changes, because they are so large, because they set the norms, and because they buy and sell to everyone in the industry in one way, shape or form. So this is the keystone actor hypothesis, that if these keystone changes, we restructure the industry. Of course, that restructuring doesn't go on without changes in company regulation, whether it be governance, country regulation, international agreements, etc. So it's quite a complex governance landscape, but this is looking at the actions that these firms might make in creating that change. So to remap that on, here are who they are as well. So it gives you an idea of how collectively they're big. This is the interesting number. For some of the most valuable fisheries, they control about 35% of it. So it's not control in an antitrust sort of dreadful sort of way of control, but if they all change, then 1/3 to 1/4, or 1/3 to 40% of these particular fisheries will change. And this is also where, as accountants, we'll see organisations, my ecological colleagues see all these fish species up the top, and so they see it as an ecological sample. I see it as an economic sample. Of course, this is a mix of them both. And there's really interesting sort of questions to ask about their different subsidiary approaches, the extent to which they hold control, the extent to which they delegate control. So it's quite, again, an interesting organisational science question about how they go about doing what they do. They're also spread across the globe. So to come back to this is that list of SDGs, but arranged in a slightly different way. And in particular, the CBOS experiment primarily is a partnership experiment. So it's looking at how people come together to do things. It's really interested in life below the water because it's about ocean stewardship and it's about fish. With my accent, it's always a good word to say. It's about sustainable production and consumption because that's what they're trying to achieve with fish protein. And fish protein, I mean, it has a side thing right across the equalities dimension as well. For us, fish is a luxury food. For a huge percentage of the world population, fish is the thing that actually gets them their base protein and micronutrients. So it's a really important source of livelihoods. It also then has decent work within it as well, because these firms, this industry, is got systemic problems in it, primarily forced labour. So a fishing industry, along with DIY, along with all sorts of other things, is completely infused with forced labour concerns, and so that's one of their big social objectives. And then there's also climate change as well. For these firms, climate manifests itself in two ways: their ability to still catch fish and the effect on the oceans and whether or not they're going to have a raw materials supply, which is also maybe why they've come together, because they know they're in big trouble because their resources being underplayed. But they would also say eat fish because it's got a fraction of the footprint of beef, and so they have got a strong market incentive in there as well. So it all looks very sort of, sustainable development, and it's not, it's economic. Economics sits right the core behind all of these things as well. And then we have a slight plus on life on land, because particularly fish meal, which sustains the increased eating of fish, is also land-based as well. So very quickly you're into soy, you're into wheat, you're into palm oil, which has its own whole set of problems associated with it. And then finally, at the end of the day, they see themselves as zero hunger companies, because they're generating food resources and bringing it to consumers across the globe. So you can see that with the SDGs, we tend to have assemblages of them pulled together around a particular problem set. So some of them are sort of like one-to-one. Well, I'm looking at carbon disclosure, but if you're looking at carbon disclosure, you're probably looking on life on land as well. In this particular case study, we're looking at the intersections of those elements and how they play through in corporate strategy, corporate decision-making, and corporate behaviour. So the first time that we had a go at saying anything about this in the accounting literature is in this paper, along with 1, 2, 3 science colleagues and a finance colleague, and then the rest of it is organisational scientists. And writing this paper and assembling our ideas around the Anthropocene was really important, because it was our conceptual boundary object, if you like, because we all had some sense of what that meant to us for our own disciplinary backgrounds. And so we had an ability to have a conversation through a key concept. Now that key concept might be resilience, it could be risk, it could be markets, it could be values, but it was a way of being more interdisciplinary, because, quite frankly, these guys were a mystery to me until I started working with them, but we started talking around something concrete and conceptual that worked for all of us, and I think that's a really important thing to emphasise. On land in the 1950s, there was something called the Great Acceleration, where resource and energy use really shot up. The blue acceleration started on the ocean in about the year 2000. So there's a big land grab going on across all sorts of sectors and industries in the ocean, because previous to that it wasn't fully utilised. The idea that we're working
once the requirement is finalized, then only we can start working on the configuration or any
that is a heroic assumption.
data file creation for the same.
It's the basis on which we are doing this hypothesis, and we've got a scientific hypothesis that we're 6 years into trying to make sense of, but we think it will easily take us 12 before we know whether or not we've got anywhere. We can see we're getting somewhere, but we're maybe not fully there yet. As I said before, these are keystone actors. We're engaging in systematic conversations with them in the form of keystone dialogues. So we meet, in usual conditions, we meet in person twice a year and several times in between, and you'll see how much. And then, if you like, we're back into the governance literature, the things that we might look at within accounting and finance. Are we getting norm cascades? Are we getting private governance schemes coming together? Because this is a private, sort of a green club, if you like, and there's club goods that arise from green clubs, but looking at how that is achieved. This is an extent of the dialogues, and I'll talk about the number of people in due course, but several things to notice. This is not a small group, minor investment kind of activities. So there's 2 dialogues a year, until recently in person, where we go where the places are headquartered of these firms The early top-line dialogues are the working meetings where all the sustainability managements, the procurement managements, the investment people along with the scientists go to. The other ones, which are these big set pieces, are with the CEOs. So the CEOs of these 10 companies give us about 3 days a year where they come and set the strategy for the next year, and then their operational staff take it forward from there. So for them, that's quite a big investment for them to assemble somewhere and do that work. We have been, I would say, immensely lucky, but we also worked at it pretty hard, that in the 6 years we've been working with them, we've had turnover of CEOs in all but 2 of the companies. And so the outgoing CEOs have negotiated the ongoing commitment of the incoming CEO to the strategic purpose of this particular initiative. And that's involved a lot of investment. Speaking of investment, these are 3 philanthropic funders from the US. They fund the science team. So we do not receive, and we never wish to receive, any money from the companies, and that we're in a science advisory role, and we will offer them advice, we will do research on them, but we're not accountable to them, so we can come and go at our own event. With three funding rounds in, we're trying to negotiate the 4th funding round at the moment. To give you an idea of the kind of cash behind it, these guys have put in about 10 million US over 3 tranches. We are now, I think we're in the position to be able to go to local funding councils, because we started off with the funding councils and they said it would never work. So we now feel we can go back to them and say, we think we've got some more interesting questions to open up here. So lots of people, lots of dialogues, you're rather engaging, but also, quite frankly, terrifying at the same time. So here is what they have signed up to do. And in particular, there's quite a lot of commitments that they made. They made this back in 2016. Some of these were not a surprise to the scientists. Other things the firms put on the table as being something that they wanted to collectively to resolve. And the question they were asked is that, what could you do together in partnership with science that you could not do on your own? And this is what they picked. So transparency and traceability, endangered species, modern slavery, antibiotics in aquaculture. The other thing, this is a seafood tour of the world. Any kind of seafood you want to be put off eating, come and talk to me and I'll tell you more about it, because it's really quite scary. Through to plastics, greenhouse gases, etc. So things like plastics in the oceans in 2016, it was pre-Attenborough, so no one knew it was there, but they knew it was something coming over the horizon that they needed to deal with. And in terms of thinking, well, that's all very esoteric, here are the core accounting topics and the finance topics at the heart of this. So the whole idea about transparency, corporate transparency, reporting, how do you convey your information to stakeholders and to the capital markets? Likewise, traceability, how do you track things through the process? And they've invested quite a lot in that. So, accounting is starting to think about blockchain and those sorts of things. That's traceability technology of one particular sort. Accounting and biodiversity, which of course is one of the reasons why Mike Jones is going to be celebrated in this meeting, because he was the guy that really sort of picked up and developed that idea of IUU fishing endangered species through accounting and biodiversity intersections. Modern slavery, there's now starting to be an emerging literature in that, but it's been around for a longer time, but accounting is getting involved in that. Obviously greenhouse gas emissions, etc., it's there. So whilst these are technical topics for a seafood company, they are also accounting and finance topics as well. These two things mesh together. And what we're trying to do is to put the science and the social science mesh in play. So that's the science. We deliver science to these guys to try to resolve that. How we do that is through background briefs. So if you've got people who are thinking about impact, impact can come after the event or it can come through the process. So each one of these briefs are written for the CEO dialogues. They're 6 pages max. They are peer-reviewed through other academic channels, but they distill all of the literature down to a particular conclusion for them. Because most of the knowledge that we produce and spend time developing is behind paywalls, and quite frankly, incomprehensible to anyone but ourselves. So this is one of the big jobs that we do, is we integrate those insights and offer them to the companies. Other things we do, though, is we do original surveys for them. So what's the baseline of their sustainability reporting? We've done supply chain questionnaires for them, looked at, well, what are people saying in their own organisations about what they're doing. So I've obviously been involved in some of these, but things like corporate sustainability leadership, much more management, but still in business and management studies. So these are the dialogue papers. They are all publicly available unless they contain sensitive information, in which case they're in private. But there's a lot of publicly available material there. And what we have just published earlier this year is the first 6 years description of what we have done with these firms. And this is where some sort of sense of what science publishing looks like. You don't do 1/18 of a job, okay? It depends where you are. So Henrik Osterblom is our lead. So he assembled this material, but everyone in the list has put some element of it together. And it's quite relaxing researching in this way, as long as you're not leading it, because you get told, I need 2.5 pages and a table on X, and you generate it, and then it gets stitched together, and then it gets revised and revised and revised. This went to 9 outlets before we got somebody to accept it, because it was too social science. I mean, can you imagine what a rude thing to say about something as wonderful as that? So this is, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is drawn from this paper, which is when we're trying to look at how do you mobilise keystones. Now, the paper itself is quite short, and before I did any science publishing, I always wondered how they got away with papers of 11 pages in length. But attached to every scientific paper are supplementary materials. And it's the supplementary materials which provides the evidence base in many instances for what's in here. The supplementary materials on this one is 137 pages long. It's got every agenda we ever constructed. It's got the memorandum of understanding for the setting up of the CBOS Foundation. How does it work? It's got lots and lots of data. And what we were trying to do with that was to provide a map that if you wanted to do one of these things in any industry you like, here is a map. Not the map, but a map of how it came together, whereas the paper itself is this huge synthesis of all of this at a quite high level. So it's worth, if you're reading science, to realise the good stuff is often tucked away elsewhere. And so what we have done with this is that we have been tracking every science and business meeting that took place over that 6 years. So particularly to the PhD students in the audience, you know how your supervisor says, keep a research diary, keep a note of everything. This is very, very good advice. We kept a note of every interaction that we ever had, and because we thought at some stage we might be interested in drawing data together of this sort. And so this is us collectively, the scientists, and then these are all the member companies, and we can see a changing pattern of interaction over time. So my science colleagues see this as a way of understanding patterns of complexity and collaboration in contexts that are highly mobile but also highly complex. So they're looking at trying to tease out these patterns of complexity and what they get you at the end of the day. It's quite a different framing to the kind of things that I've always thought about, but it also tells us something about how do organisations assemble their own activities, because we know a lot about each one of the companies, as well as how do companies achieve things together. So you're back into core business and management territory again. Working this out, then for me personally, this is about 90 meetings a year of some kind of interaction. It could be a full day meeting, or it could be 2 hours. And then there's lots of meetings with the scientists together in order to be able to generate the knowledge and insight we need to support the companies. So this is it's spread out and intensive. Well, some of the times it's intensive, but it's also a spread out process as well. It keeps on going over many, many years. And as I say, we think we're about halfway there. The kind of things that the companies have actually done, and here I sort of cut to the chase to a certain extent, because you can characterise all of these patterns of interactions. But what we know is that we've been trying to look at what they started off in 2016, where are they now? So some of them they were already quite advanced, but not the Japanese companies, because they hadn't started reporting at that stage. So the Japanese companies have travelled the furthest in terms of starting to use GRI reports and thinking about materiality. How do they then manage that with hundreds of subsidiaries, etc., and bring that to the fore? One of the interesting things is, and it was the Japanese companies who spearheaded this, is that they started to publicly disclose their production volumes. That is, what fish are they catching or buying across the world, and then looking at under what conditions are those fish caught under. Are they in sustainable fishery yield? Are they the Marine Stewardship Council? Do they not know what the biological standard that they're working against? So this work, it took the first company 2 years to gather that data. And you think, well, of course they always know. Of course they know what fish they've got, but they've never organised it in that way. So it's taken them at least a couple of years to build up their accounting information systems, their procurement systems, and the other financial information that they would attach to procurement to give them a chance to be able to understand what their baseline is before they get into interactions. But they are trying to change what they do at the same time. About this time last year, we got over the hurdle, which we've been working at for quite some time, to have time-bound goals. They're publicly available, and they are to achieve certain outcomes across IUU fishing, labour abuse, antibiotics, plastics, and endangered species. And then this is moving at a slightly different pace, but it will, by this time, by end of this year, it will be there. Because they're in different country contexts, the climate change governance processes have been quite different in those countries, but the countries after the last COP in Glasgow have now unified their expectations about climate reporting. So everyone will be doing science-based targets initiative outcomes. And then we'll see our first report that they're writing, not us, happily, about how the whole thing has worked. But they've been producing their own reports for a number of years. So one of the new phases that we're in the middle, we've been working on it for a few years, but we're sort of in the middle of it to a certain extent, is this commitment. And this is where a lot of my work has been focused on characterising the nature of forced labour. Where does it arise in supply chains? Can you find it through traditional audit techniques? And the answer is you can't. You need a bunch of special skills to find these things. And then what are people saying about reporting about these factors? And so one of the things that they knew early on is they wanted to know where in their supply chains would they have IUU, illegal fishing, and labour abuse risks. And so we've been working on that for a couple of years. And this paper is just out. It was out last Tuesday. I'm so relieved this came out in time, because otherwise I'd have to sort of make some general statements around this. So this has been one of the most exciting papers I've ever got to work on, but also one of the hardest. It's in a high-profile place, so it took about a year of revisions and resubmissions to get it out through Nature Communications. So that was pretty hard work. But what we've done as a group is that we've got some spatial data scientists in the group who take global fishing watch data, which is the pings of where all the vessels are, and use AI technology to figure out what are suspicious-looking vessel patterns. So if you turn your AIS off, you're already suspicious. At that stage, we're a bit worried about you. But there's also vessels coming together and spending a set amount of time together would lead you to believe they're transferring fish. And if that's not allowed in that particular area of the ocean, you know you've got potential illegal activity going on. So there's the eyes in the sky part of this, and this is one of the co-authors is with the Global Fishing Watch and has helped facilitate access to the data and analysis of it. And then the other side, because I'm an organisational scientist, I of course say, well, where does this fish go? Let's go and ask people about ports. And so there's about 4,000 fishing ports across the globe, but that was the early stage of the work because there was no one list. So it took us about a year to establish how many there were and where they were. You would have thought they'd be straightforward, but apparently it wasn't, which was quite hard work. And then we did a survey and said, of these ports, if you know them, are they good ports or do they have low, medium, high probability of landing illegal fish, or are these places where people enter forced labour? And so this is not a very cheerful response, but of the 750, almost a quarter of the ports that we managed to find out data about them, at least half of them associated with one or the other risk. So we now know that we've got an interesting organisational object that we had no idea might matter, and that's the ports. So ports is a novel source of governance where if you as a company want to make sure that your supply chains are robust, you need robust ports. For the CBOS companies, they know which ports they land in, and so there's a series of bilateral work going on where they can offer more protection around places where they're landing fish and places in the sea where their fish are sourced from. And this is a model of change that they have adopted very self-consciously. They're not going to walk away from dangerous places because there's tons of dangerous places, but rather they're going to stay and try to reform the governance around those places so that it can be safe for the whole industry. Now that's a stewardship approach as opposed to, say, a risk management approach to make sure you're not in any bad places, because they are in bad places. This whole industry is in bad places because bad places are well represented in this production system. What it also allows us to do is sort of quite mad things like this. So this is at-risk areas at sea, and we can find out where do these vessels park their loads. So where do they go to, which ports do they go to in order to deliver their payloads. Sometimes they go, and the colours crossing across, sometimes they go close to home, and other instances they go a long way away to land their fish. There's something called the Port State Measures Agreement, which is a way countries sign up to it and they strengthen their compliance at ports for landing illegal fish. If your country is signed up to it, a bunch of the boats that have the naughty looking patterns, they bypass you. So that gives you some sense that governance is creating this diversification of these long product procurement lines. And that's taking into account the cost of going further afield versus landing more closely and being able to consolidate at some stage. From anyone who knows my work, you know I did not do the numbers, okay? Because numbers are something I find really quite terrifying. So we have a dedicated data scientist who is equally excited about working with us because he never thought of ports. And I say, right, okay, so when are we going to visit some people and have a conversation? And his mind blows because he never realised you could talk to people, the poor fellow. So this is what I mean by the strengths that we have, is that we think of organisations and these vast networks and we think about chatting to them and making sense of what they do. We also think of looking at their annual reports, at their non-financial reports, etc. So we're just starting out a whole process of trying to figure out what the ports are looking like. So we have some sense that there's heterogeneity in them. This is where particularly you see, Stuart thought I was never going to get to the public sector, but here we are at the heart of the public sector. A great number of ports are either regionally or owned by countries. So we've got a really strong public sector element in here. But also there's a lot of hybrids as well. And sometimes ports see themselves purely as a nexus of trade. Other ports see themselves as being about local economic development and creating a whole infrastructure of well-being and economic well-being and all sorts of things around their port structures. So we think we're going to see some quite different sort of port constellations. At the moment, the main thing we're discovering is that none of them seem to produce financial reports. So we're kind of depressed about that, but we'll figure out a way around that. And we're also likely to spend a bit more time in Peru because we're doing an offshore, the broader team, are doing an offshore we've got a proof of concept, so this is a scaling up pilot of traceability on boats catching anchovies off Peru. And then we're going to see where they land and talk to all the ports where they land to think about what we might do together. But for the record, I'm never going to Mogadishu. I'm sure it's very nice, but it scares me. So, moving on into the cash. So one of the things that we've been doing alongside of all of this is trying to figure out if there's any leverage point that can be achieved by the finance system, in particular banks, owners and stock exchanges. So this is a slightly older paper. It was done on the 100 largest seafood companies, and what we were interested in finding out was how the banks might be treating specific conditions on their loans. At that stage there were none and we couldn't get hold of any data on that. We looked at how stock exchanges might be exposed to some of this risk, and we looked at shareholders. So this is kind of interesting because stock exchange governance is a really important topic in accounting and finance, and if the seafood industry goes down, these 3 or 4 go down with it, particularly the Tokyo Exchange is massively exposed to seafood related risk and risk on the oceans. So this is the source point for one of my PhD students studied to actually look at that more systematically. Not something I would have thought about if we hadn't have been involved in this work. And then this is the 100 largest companies by headquarters and by shareholder ownership. I was really stunned, and I have no idea if it's purely seafood, but headquarter location and shareholder identity are really strongly linked in this industry. I'd always thought that everything was mixed up and it was global, but for these guys it's not. It's got a very distinctive in-country feel to it. And what we tried to do here, and I just sort of say at a very sort of light level, is that we were looking at network density and whether or not there are any investment houses or single share owners that were invested in everyone, and if we worked with them, could they change the system? So there's some chains in here which are kind of interesting, but if you come over the greater than 10%, there's no ability to get an individual shareholder effect. You might rework all the rules for everyone, but there's no leverage point for finance. So that was a finding that we didn't want, but it's probably important to know that if you think that's going to make things happen. So to try to bring all that together, and as you can imagine, there's any amount of, happy to answer questions. Honestly, every single discipline area of accounting and finance could be used productively and wonderfully within the CBOS group. At the moment, the kind of people we've got in CBOS is that some of the scientists who are primarily ecologists, but also systems scientists. They also have finance expertise as well, but we have a specialist finance person within there. Carlos Laranaga, who many of you will know, who I write with a lot, Shona Russell and myself are the core of the sort of organisational science team, but then we've had postdocs and we've got PhDs working on other aspects of the questions as well. So from the organisational science side, there's probably about 6 to 8 of us that are centrally involved, but then a network of easily another 10 people that we draw on from various times. On the core science side, there's probably about 5 core scientists, and then there's another 30 worldwide that we're drawn on for various things. So this is big science. This is what science teams look like, I'm led to believe, but all of that expertise, if you like, is drawn in particular papers and particular activities. On the company side, we have the 10 CEOs. We also quite often have one of the lead VPs for Mitsubishi who are not part of this but are interested in it at all times and in all ways. And then in each company there's anything between 2 and 10 operational people who are involved in it in one way or another. So as a virtual team, it's a big group, but each part of it there's some storyline and some papers that we're building together to try to figure out how you get control over these multifaceted, really complex systems. Particularly, I need some forensic accountants because how do you detect forced labour? Because it's illegal, it's immoral, it's hidden, it's really, really nasty stuff. So our standard audits don't get it. Standard reporting isn't able to describe it. So there's something forensic and necessary in that area. So I'm currently reasonably obsessed about that. Extended corporate governance. We've almost got a natural lab to a certain extent of looking at how the Japanese companies move quite differently from the other Asian companies, which are quite different from the ones with the more Anglo-American sort of ethos to them. We're starting to be able to make some observations about organisations that are themselves wholly owned compared to ones that are on the stock exchange and the kind of tensions that might emerge from that. What we hope we might do is, because we're not going to add any more to CBOS because it's sort of doing its own thing, but we're just at the stage that lots of people want to join CBOS, and in fact it's up to them whether or not anyone joins, but they're not that keen on it, is to get a shadow group running alongside and following a CBOS example. So the things you might do in order to reduce your risk of illegal fishing and forced labour, that's on the website, it's publicly available. Anyone can pick up and use it if they wish. Some of the standard setting organisations in marine fisheries and aquaculture are thinking about incorporating it into their standard requirements. And at that stage, we think we've got that cascade, because that's what we're looking for. Change these guys, the whole thing changes. Ports, absolutely massive. And then, of course, the guys that we work with are always looking to develop their expertise, both from, there's a lot of seafood people who want to understand more about finance, there's lots of finance people that are needing to understand more about other things as well. So it all comes together in that glorious mix. So I told you it's going to be high level. There's any number of sort of detail and underneath it, but I'll leave this up here because this is something that is sort of increasingly exercising me, and I think it might be something that Giovanna might speak about in her keynote as well, is that there are different perspectives, there's different ways into this debate. And if I can channel a dear but departed colleague, Rob Gray would be horrified that you're all interested in ESG. Because 30 years ago I knew that was a question kind of thing. And this is where it's quite different because it depends where you come from. So you can come from a focus on ESG and then figuring out how do these things affect organisations and value, through to an Earth system and society perspective that then looks for where the accounting is in it. My work with CBOS is the Earth system and society focus. That's not better or worse, it's just where it is from a position. And this is where double materiality becomes important. And then obviously these two things mix together in complex ways, so you end up with dynamic materiality. So I'll just leave that up there as hopefully a helpful way of navigating where lots of people doing lots of things in this field, they tend to be from one of those two perspectives. I see them as complementary, but they are different perspectives.
Jan, thank you very much. That was really fascinating, wasn't it? You know, we all eat fish, don't we? Or most of us eat fish, so it's really, really, really fascinating. And I think it's really good, Jan. I mean, my question was, and hopefully other people will have questions, I mean, are people genuinely interested in what accountants have to say? I wondered.
Yes, and maybe not in operations so much because they have their own accountants. I think scientists are interesting because in this whole sort of global change thing, you tend to see, there's work by economists, which is really valuable and looks at like economic systems and big things. Then there's a lot of work from sociologists looking at communities and households and organisations. If we think about how you're going to be low carbon, those two things sort of emerge. But most people don't look at that landscape in the middle and where the organisations are and where the capital markets are and where banks are and lending decisions are. And so I think there's something about that mid-layer that articulates between those two things that you could see, and broadly our discipline, we tend to either come with a sociological sensibility or an economic sensibility, and we bring that to accounting and finance studies, and that is where there's a huge amount of action. And we really do need to talk to people about ourselves in that space. So one of the early questions that I got from some of my ecological colleagues is that, when a stock price goes up and down, they thought the company got the cash. And it was sort of like, oh, okay, sorry, right, how do I explain a stock market? But of course, why wouldn't they? I mean, that would be quite a logical thing to think. So I've spent a lot of time sort of writing wee primers. They keep on going, oh God, another primer's coming from Jan. Okay, how do stock markets work? So there's initial public offerings, and it's been quite good for me because we're so comfortable with our own knowledge about the systems in which we operate, we forget to tell anyone. So I think the scientists are more interested in us than most people.
That's great news. So, okay, so questions? Anybody like to ask a question?
Jan, can you tell us, you spoke just now about how you told the scientist, how the finance system works in our language, but can you say something about how you approach what they were doing and trying to understand, in a sense, the ecological problem that you're facing is more core to their discipline than perhaps to ours?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering whether you can tell us a little bit about that interdisciplinary experience and how you got yourself prepared for it.
Yeah. Partly, for about 6 years, it must have been, it was in my 30s when I had energy because I couldn't have done it now, sort of thing. I worked for the UK Sustainable Development Commission, so it was a day-a-week public appointment that I did alongside my academic job. And that ruined me for disciplinary-only work because I was the Scottish Vice Chair of that, and so I had to take the Climate Change Act through the Parliament, and so I was asked by government to to bring people together and chair briefings on climate change. And they thought I was doing them a favour. Quite frankly, they were doing me a favour because I started to build my own ecological literacy. And I'm not a natural scientist, so I definitely know the limits of my understanding. But just by consistently exposing myself to the science that I could understand and grab hold of. And in this respect, there's some really great science sort of books about fish or about phosphorus or whatever. So I often will start at sort of the popular science end of things and then figure out which articles and journals to look at. And seek advice in that area as well. And so one of the things that I think about all disciplines is that there's a variety of perspectives. So if you went out there and tried to find the economic study that explains, I don't know, fish economics or whatever, you would find many different perspectives. So even knowing the perspectives and how they fit together is quite important. So you do have to do a lot of reading, but personally I find it pleasurable reading. And the first paper that outlined these companies might matter, I saw presented at a conference, and then I watched for it to come out, and I approached them and said, okay, I don't think you know anything about organisations, but I do, can I come and visit you? So you also have to hang around in some non-relevant spaces to hear things that you could help with and be a part of.
Okay, other questions? Oh, somebody at the back, Stuart. Sorry, Stuart's doing the mic duty.
I thought Stuart was going to ask me a question.
I know, I thought he was too.
Check. Thank you so much, Professor Jan Bebbington, for the stimulating presentation. I have a question because you mentioned about in some concluding comments about financing the change, and then you mentioned about the sustainability loan, linked loan. Do you think how is the direction is going for this kind of research? Thank you.
Jan, would you just paraphrase that question? Because online they're not hearing properly.
Okay.
Please.
So the question was, so looking at particularly the finance space, so and how sustainability is becoming incorporated into it. I think there on the financing from banks level, there's two things that are coming through that. The first one is specific bond issues that might be green or blue in our case. So there's sort of dedicated things. Then there are sustainability-linked loans, which are quite core refinancing, but they have social environmental conditions attached to them. And you get, if you meet those things, you get a lower interest rate. At the moment, the difference in the interest rate isn't large enough to really matter to a certain extent, depending on how much you're borrowing. And at first, they were sort of like you got a lower interest rate if you did good things, but now they're going in both directions. So if you don't do the things asked for, you get a higher interest rate. So they're sort of working through the system. In the back of the accounting regulation side of things, it makes huge problems for valuation of financial instruments because you've lost the certainty. So there's a whole sort of standard setting intervention that some people are trying to go on in order to sort out that problem area, because it might stop that. Then you've got shareholders that might be ethical investors of some sort, but they might be doing it as a portfolio, they might be doing it specifically, so there's sort of those things going on there. And then there are, for example, how you might, financing the transition is quite a tricky one as to whether or not you do it on your own or do you do it countrywide, and there's lots of countrywide activities going on as well, or whether or not you would do it maybe as a sector and maybe seek differential funding. So there are starting to be funding pots available for transition to net zero in different countries, etc. So I think the financing to change the propensity to carry on the way you are is there. But then there's this massive row, and I'm now looking at Lynn, there's massive row about tax and subsidies. So currently, building boats is subsidised enormously because it's a projection of power onto the water. And particularly with the high seas being outside of national jurisdiction, there's a huge amount of boat building and port building going on, but there's more boats on the ocean than there are fish to catch. And so you create these adverse environmental effects from tax incentives. And that same debate's going on with oil and gas and whatnot. So I think there's a big, tax incentives, taxing beneficial ownership being hidden in offshore areas, etc. So there's a huge tax angle that we haven't even really begun to open out, but there's a big one there. It's a pity that you've taken retirement. That's just not fair.
Thanks, Jan. Thank you so much. It's really interesting, comprehensive, and this is honestly, like a new era of research, which is I would like, to encourage all my colleagues to work on the new perspective. However, I have noticed, like in terms of ESG, when we are talking about ESG and you are trying to bring different subsidiary here, as we probably know, we look at, for example, what about the role of systems, the role of culture, because it's ESG something to do with the national culture, with the identity, and the implementation, it will not be like the same level across different subsidiaries, and could be like, thank you so much, that's what I would like to add.
And I think, like ESG, I mean, we're going to fight about ESG for ages yet as an academic community. I can feel it coming on. Because those words, each word is really, really fuzzy and means all sorts of things, will mean different things in different places to different people. And so I think this is where qualitative research, actually getting into decision makers' mindsets, particularly in the capital markets, but what do they mean by E, S, and G? And how do these things interact? So I think there's definitely a role, because people are building data sets around ESG, there's a role, but actually they're still fuzzy and noisy, and I think we need to get under the skin of what that might be, because there's going to be a lot of work done in the name of ESG, and if it's effective and it's good, I'm delighted. But if it's just buzz and nothing happens, then I think I'd be heartbroken for that lost opportunity.
Okay, another question. Come on, Stuart.
Excellent.
Ron?
I've got a loud voice. Hi, thank you. That was excellent and good to see a very large-scale global interdisciplinary project where the accountants are closely involved as well. My question is that the Anthropocene, the fundamental issue about the Anthropocene is the human species. And it's primarily a cultural crisis. And culturally, we have been a very arrogant, dominating, bullying, exploiting, expropriative species on the planet. That's why we are here. So in this kind of a global project, what kind of cultural reflexivity is going on deep down? And I'll tell you a little bit why. Because I come from a culture where the Anthropocene was seen thousands of years ago. And we actually, in our culture, we said that if the human species is the most intelligent, it should be the most responsible and accountable on the planet. So it should be the most caring, the most compassionate. We have been vegetarians for thousands of years. So I mean, this fish issue, of course, for us kind of looking at it, things like, why such an obsession with killing, From our point of view, that's how we see it. But I'm just asking a broader question, which is, and I looked at the names on the list, and I didn't see a lot of diversity on the scientific committees and on all of that. And again, we're seeing that kind of transformation coming through. But do we, as experts, and experts, another thing, experts are very powerful people, so they themselves can be very arrogant and in their own behavior. And so I know something that nobody else does, kind of thing. So how do we deal with that? Thank you.
At essence, I think you're right, that there is a, I mean, the Anthropocene is a carrier for many ideas from many disciplines. The carrier it offers in this context is whether or not transnational corporations can be modified to such an extent that we actually get rid of their worst effects in that respect. It's a carrier for other sorts of ideas about the nature of the human condition, the relationship between nature and humanity. And I always found it quite sort of weird that some people say, oh, well, this is post-Enlightenment thinking, and that people are integrated into nature. I mean, I didn't know they weren't, which is sort of kind of surprising that we think that we're finally at that stage. So I think there's a sense in which the Anthropocene provides all these conversation spots across all sorts of things. If you were to wish to look at some of those in more depth, you probably wouldn't start with this cohort of actors. You'll be heading somewhere quite different. And that would be an entirely legitimate and super pace to go. Given they are in the seafood business, then I think we're dealing with the business they're in. Alongside this, though, there's another big keystone process that is sort of not quite taking off, which is the Ocean 100, which is the 100 largest corporate entities that are operating on the ocean. And there you get much more into a more diverse set. I mean, half of them are oil and gas, so hopefully they'll disappear. But then there's like seaweed farming, there's all sorts of things in there. And across all of these, there's like the big corporation and the local community interactions. So in some parts of the science discipline, the best thing that these big companies could do is to behave better offshore, because then onshore won't be so impoverished. So there is a big onshore-offshore interaction, which is not directly mediated by the companies, because they're not involved in onshore small-scale fisheries, but their actions create possibilities for that. And so there's some projects that people are involved with to look at those intersections around particular health and well-being and protein challenges, hotspots of which West Africa would be a really important place where that's being played out. But on the deeper philosophical thing, no question, you're right.
But it ought to be there, right?
It is there, but it's not everywhere at all times. So that there's a big environmental, humanities and philosophy area that's being motivated and understood by the Anthropocene, and that sits, somewhere in that landscape.
Okay, well, we've raised a lot of questions. We don't have time for all the answers, unfortunately. Brilliant question. Can I just ask you all to thank Jan again before we move to our next session? Thank you.